Hi, I'd like to share an article with you. The article is published in a website called theconversation.com. You haven't got any dates about when it is published, but the title of that is Xi Jinping's grip on power is absolute, but there are new threats to his Chinese dream. The author is Professor of Asia Pacific Security Studies, Macquarie University, which is a Australian university, Professor Bates Gill. And he is also an associate fellow with the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, London. Professor Gill did put forward a pretty accurate description of the backgrounds of the Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is a princeling. He also went through the hard time during the Cultural Revolution when his father's power was removed by then Chairman Mao. And then, of course, after Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping took power, and then his father got back into power, and he Xi Jinping has a very rapid rise through the different ranks, and eventually became the supreme leader of the Chinese government. That's all correct. I'm not disputing his data. What I'm trying to talk to you about in this particular video is the viewpoint and the interpretation of the role of the role of Xi Jinping in the eyes of the Chinese people. Professor Gill looked at the events through a Western lens, which is completely understandable because, after all, Professor Gill is a Westerner, and he is a fellow of the London-based think tank, as well as a professor at Australian universities. That is totally understandable. But unfortunately, the Chinese doesn't share his views because the Chinese is not looking at the role of Xi Jinping from the Western eyes. They are looking at Xi Jinping from the Chinese point of view. And that's what I'd like to explain to you. Now, in this video, I'm going to explain to you several things. First of all, the Chinese mindset, basically, and then try to explain to you why the Chinese can tolerate the huge grip of power. First of all, let me put forward a theory first. The theory is actually supported by evidence, so I will give you the evidence as well. Now, the theory is that when a culture of a group is externally controlled, then it will, of course, conform to the external pressure. But once that external pressure is removed, then it will quickly return to its already the past culture. Where's the evidence? Okay, the evidence is a Mosul group, which is a minority group in China. This is the so-called the only one or two remaining ethnic groups, which is the property ownership is passed down through the female lines rather than the male's line. So in this particular group, the ethnic group, when a girl reaches maturity, she will have her own room. And then she will be able to invite boys or young men, which she likes, to her room to pass the night. And on the daytime, this boy or young man will go back to his mother's house to live the rest of the day. So a man, will always remain with his mother, not his father, with his mother. Although at night he may spend his night somewhere else. During the beginning of the People's Republic of China, and especially during Cultural Revolution, this ethnic group is forced to follow the so-called normal man lead role. But once that external pressure is removed, the ethnic group quickly return back to this maternal lead culture. So what I'm trying to argue here is that the Chinese culture, although being suppressed during Mao's time under communist rule, and especially a very large-scale destruction during the Cultural Revolution, once that external pressure is removed, the Chinese return to its own cultural heritage. Okay, so that's my first point. The second point I want to explain to you is Chinese, unlike the Western mindset, is not expansionist. Again, I want to support my argument with an example. An example exists by comparison between the time when Columbus reached the west coast of Africa. 60 years before that, the great admiral from China, Jinping, reached the east coast of Africa. But how these two groups dealt with the indigenous people in Africa is almost like heaven and hell. What the Westerner did was colonization, looting, capturing people as slaves, and then shipping them back to Europe initially, and then eventually to America. That's history. There's no argument about that. And 60 years before, when Jinping reached the East Coast, the Chinese didn't colonize Africa. If they want to, they have all the power to do it. Because 60 years before Columbus reached the west coast of Africa, the Jinping's fleet is 10 times and even more, a couple of 10 times more powerful than Columbus' only ship. Columbus lead only one ship, whereas Jinping leads a fleet of hundreds, with an entourage as many as 10,000 people, compared with a few hundred people on board Columbus' vessel. So you see, if Chinese really wanted to colonize at that time, 60 years earlier, they can. And of course, if Chinese did that, the whole history might have changed. But how do you know the Chinese actually reach this area at the East Coast Africa? Well, the Jinping's fleet did bring back a giraffe. And at that time, the Chinese painters did paint a giraffe. Okay, so there's evidence there. The evidence is that the Chinese is not expansionist like the Western. Okay, so that is one important thing we have to remember. So arguing that the Chinese now building up the South China Sea is expansionist is a misunderstanding of the Chinese mindset. Chinese do not think in that mindset. It is your Western view which is wrong. The second point I would like to say is that about 300 years ago, when the West met with China again, China said to the Europeans, we have everything. We don't need to trade with you. But the Westerners forced their will on Chinese, and they used the gunboats. So this is gunboat diplomacy. Okay. We know that at that time, Chinese army cannot fight with the cannons from the West, although gunpowder was invented by the Chinese. It is quite ridiculous, isn't it? But again, this is history. Okay, so for about 300 years, the Chinese go through an era of humiliation. Okay, just remember, the Chinese population can grow to the current size is because the land can able to support this population. Otherwise, Chinese will not be able to grow to this size of population. And hence, the Chinese have maintained a culturally leading for the past 2,000 years, except the last 2 to 300 years. Okay, but unfortunately, during this time, the Chinese culture lost its confidence about their cultural validity, and that's where the May 4th movements come in. They try to learn from the West and introduce all the concepts from the West, including, of course, communism. Now, communism is not invented in China. Everybody knows that, okay? It is introduced from the West, and including Dr. Sen. He introduced the idea of republic, and he introduced the idea of democracy into China. But we have to remember, these are Western ideas. When the Chinese is able to practice their own culture, they will always revert back to their own heritage. And this is not the Chinese heritage to adopt a communist party, and that's why Mao eventually failed, because it is not the Chinese style. Now, after Deng Xiaoping opened up, the Chinese refused to follow the democratic path, like the collapse of USSR. We know after the collapse of USSR, Russia tried to adopt the democracy path, and the whole country fall into chaos. And in China, all the Chinese will hate its country falling into chaos. So a strong government is very much a tradition. Chinese always appreciate a strong leading government, which also gives them a stable environment to develop. And that is exactly what Xi Jinping is promising the people in China. And more importantly, one of the promise is the Chinese dream and the revitalization of the Chinese culture. This is exactly what the Chinese people is expecting from their leader. And therefore, Xi Jinping can command a huge support from his people. So in terms of looking at whether Xi got his power, we have to remember Xi doesn't need to get his power from support from people outside of China. It is important for him to actually get the support from within China. Okay, so Chinese do not like to impose their ideas onto others. So Chinese have been saying, no, our Chinese model is not to be copied. Every country should try to find a path for its own development. And now the Chinese is demonstrating to the world that the democratic plus free market isn't the end of history, as the Japanese American political scientist, I can't remember his name, sorry, proposed in his book, The End of History. No, the Chinese understand if China wants to revitalize its culture, it has to do it in its own way. And she is promising to doing that. And therefore, the Chinese do not see a strong government delivering a stable environment for them to do business as a bad thing. Now, this is completely not understandable from the Western eyes. Why a surveillance state is appreciated by the Chinese? Well, to the Chinese, it's easy to trade their security with surveillance. Why not? Look at the crime rate within China compared with almost every developed countries. Now, even in developed countries, we know, well, the light of democracy, United States, the NSA is monitoring every internet messages which they can grab. Isn't our privacy also being abused? I don't see any Western scholar complaining about that. Why you complain about something which the Chinese people accept as part of the trade-off, whereas you do not complain about what happened to our privacy, where the Western side do not see it as an appropriate by government? That is totally hypocritical. At least that's my view. So what I urge everybody to understand is, you want to judge a leader, we should judge it using the lens of the leader of that country, the people in that country, not judging it through your own lens. Judging it through your own lens always may arrive to a wrong conclusion. So the role Xi Jinping plays in China can also be verified by a lot of research. If you ask the people in different countries whether their government is leading their country in the right direction, I will put a link down there for people to look at some of this data, okay? And you will find that Chinese people approve of their government at about 90%. Compare with, let's say, again, use the light of democracy, United States as an example, at about 30-something%. That is a huge difference. Of course, everybody argue, okay, the survey in China is inaccurate. People dare not speak their mind. Unfortunately, if you are in China, if you take part in that survey, you know your ambiguity is being secure. Because after all, the Chinese government is very much led by all these social measurements. The other important political thing we need to understand in China is that every session of the Chinese government has two roles. One role is execute the 5-year plan, which is planned in the last 5 years. And the second role is plan the 5-year plan for the next 5 years. So this is how the Chinese government can deliver to its people. So in that first role, the government is basically an executive branch. It is executing a plan which is given to them by the last government. At the same time, they are preparing for a blueprint for the next 5 years. Now, this is what the Chinese 5-year plan is about. Now, who designed this 5-year plan? No, it's not the politicians. If you think so, you're completely wrong. It is the social scientists from different universities and and think tanks in China proposing what the country should do in the next 5 years. And these plans are being thoroughly discussed throughout these 5 years before it is finally being endorsed and then set into motion by the government in the next 5 years. Of course, as a political leader, you need to secure your political base, and then you say, okay, Xi Jinping have secure his tenure. Okay, but basically, he has unlimited time as a president. But the Chinese people doesn't see that way. The Chinese people say, we have found a very good leader. Why don't we let him lead the country more? This is exactly, again, a different mindset. So I urge you to understand the Chinese government from the Chinese people's perspective. I speak on behalf of Chinese because I am Chinese, although I'm a citizen in Australia. But hence, I understand the Chinese mindset. At least I'm thinking about the issue in China from my own heritage. And that's why I urge people to try to understand China. Understand it from the point of view of the Chinese. When the Chinese people can get rich, can do business with the rest of the world, and the government is delivering a safe environment, why not? There's nothing wrong with that. And Chinese is not expansionist anyway. So accusing the Chinese government of securing one of the most crucial parts of Chinese trade, the South China Sea, as expansionist is a completely wrong understanding of the reason behind the Chinese government's action. Rather, we should understand it as a protection of its foreign trade. So are the Americans, right? They have 700 to 800 military bases all around the world. Now that is expansionist, okay? What the Chinese do within its own territory, just remember the idea that South China Sea doesn't belong to the Chinese or Chinese government only originates when Obama advocates the Pacific focus. So that is at most 10 or 15 years ago. And it is hypocritical to say these are not Chinese territory when the West actually recognized the South China Sea as being belong to China. Of course, everybody want to claim a piece of land. Okay, so China have acknowledged the dispute with its neighbors. So are the all other possible countries. Okay, why England or British government can have an island right at the coast of South America, thousands of miles away, whereby Chinese cannot have a number of islands hundreds of miles away. And traditionally, Chinese has always exerted rule on these islands anyway. It is hypocritical to say the Chinese are expansionists because history proves that Chinese culture isn't expansionist. What the Chinese want to do is protect their interest. That's it. No more and no less. Okay, thank you very much. And that's my comment to Professor Gil's article. If you enjoy my videos, please subscribe. Thank you. Bye.